Nobody's going to want to come. But welcome. This is really to celebrate our legendary Newburyporters exhibit that has been going on and will be going on until the end of this year. We wanted to do extra special events that talk about some of those statues and the figures behind them that the statues are based on. So for the next 5 Sundays until February 12th sometime, we'll have a speaker here at 2 o'clock. Bronson De Stadler today on Nathaniel Tracey. Bob Watts on the 22nd. He'll be talking about Timothy Palmer, the bridge builder. And then Alice Gould and myself will have a little give and take discussion with the audience about Caleb Cushing. That'll be on the 29th. Bethany Groff-Thoreau on February 5th. We'll be talking about woman and our negotiation sculpture. And then Jay Williamson on February 20th. Memberships fund that, as well as visits and donations. So think of us when you're making donations or when you're looking for a nonprofit organization to contribute to. And I also like to point out, it's going to be a little different. Notice the screen isn't down yet. So this is kind of an anti-PowerPoint Sunday afternoon. We're not going to do PowerPoints. We're not even going to do those foils. Remember foils? You put them on top of this projector back in way more than I want to think how far back it was. But we're not going to do those. Some speakers, but most speakers are just going to get up here and talk, which has been a Newburyport tradition where for hundreds of years we've had groups of people that get together, they do research on something, and then somebody gets up and talks about what they found. And that's what we're trying to recreate on this Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. We don't expect it to go much longer than an hour, so plan on spending your next few Sundays in a warm room during a cold day enjoying Newburyport history. A few news items of note. You may think we're done with that exhibit. Well, I have to tell you, we just completed the negotiations and it's been funded by the Newburyport Bank. We have 2 more statues in the making. In the room is the sculptor Jeffrey Briggs. Jeffrey, raise your hand. And he's agreed to create 2 more statues. He's working on one right now. It will be Captain William Nichols, who really should have been in the first round. He was a customs collector here in the Custom House, but more importantly, in the War of 1812, he was a privateer, and he was known as the Holy Terror, at least to the British. So that'll be a really good statue and event once that is completed in April. And during the summer, we'll have a special event where Jeffrey will create another statue. We're still kind of working out what it is and doing all the research, but it is likely to be of a Native American, of an indigenous person. Maybe Masconomet, maybe Great Tom, Old Tom, which were one of the last few indigenous peoples here in the Newberries. So we're working on that now, but more importantly, during Yankee Homecoming, we expect Jeffrey to actually be working on that statue, the clay modeling and the work associated with it, on the lawn. Oh. So all week during Yankee Homecoming, under the tent, on the lawn, you can come by, ask questions, see his process, see how it's done. So we're really excited about that. The other thing that you should be aware of is we are planning on a Maritime Days event this year. It will be held, mark your calendars, you won't want to miss this, June 29th to July 9th. So about a week, the 2 weekends around the July 4th holiday. July 4th holiday, traditionally kind of a dead time here in Newburyport. We're going to try to change that and make it exciting. Bob Cronin, some of you may know Bob. He'll be speaking here on a first Friday, I think in April. He is going to be our general chairperson for the Maritime Days event, which will include a lot of fun things to do, including dinners and other things happening. More to come. Keep your ears to the ground. There's big news coming on the Maritime Days this year. And one last thing, we have our annual meeting, March 27th. That will be held here. I think it's March 27th. Did I get that right, Susan? 23rd. That's it. 23rd, and Thursday night. And it's just where we recap the year. The board of directors, not the whole board. So that's it in terms of housekeeping items. Let me introduce someone who really doesn't require an introduction, but just in case you don't know Bronson De Stadler, he's a longtime resident of Newburyport, currently retired from a career as a clinical social worker and program director in a variety of settings. Since he's retired, he's been able to devote more time to his lifelong interest in British and American history, particularly local Newburyport history. He's a board member of the Preservation Trust and the Newburyport Chamber of Music Festival, and today he'll be speaking about the life of Nathaniel Tracey. Bronson?
Well, thank you very much. It's a thrill to see all of you here. It's a little overwhelming. So as you know, I'm going to be talking about Nathaniel Tracey, who was a remarkable figure and much underappreciated in American history. Can you hear me okay in the back? Yeah, you hear okay? All right. But first I wanted to say, there's probably two reasons why you're here today. Maybe three. The first reason is probably because you're a history nerd like me. The second reason may be because you didn't have anything to do this afternoon, but that's probably unlikely. And the third reason is I have a few friends here who come out of loyalty as well. So thank you all for coming. Nathaniel Tracey, I'll just give you a little bit of an introduction. You know, he only lived to the age of 45, but when you look at the span of his life and what happened during the period of his life, it's really quite remarkable. When he was born, King George II was king. And this was, of course, the British America, the British colony of Great Britain, which was ruling the seas and building its way to become the greatest empire and naval force in the history of our history since Rome. King George became the monarch in Britain, and rebellion during his youth and during his growing up years began to build and build. And I'll tell you some of the reasons why that built and how he participated in that. And of course, it then became a civil war, a war between the American colonies and the Great Britain Empire. And it remained a civil war until France joined the fight. And that was in, I believe, 1788. And then it became an international, half-starved, always in rags, without pay, and experiencing at times every species of distress which human nature is capable of undergoing. It is little short of a standing miracle. Really a remarkable kind of quote. Right after that, he said something like, make sure everyone gets an extra ration of liquor to be issued to every man for the perpetual peace, happiness of the United States of America. Now, I have to say, and just a kind of personal note, when I was doing the research for this, because I dove a little bit deeper into it than I had before, I was rather taken by how many similarities there were for the American rebellion and the eventual obtaining of independence, how similar many of the things which led to its success are currently at work in the war in Ukraine. I've been a little bit, obsessed about the war and watching it. And it's a completely different situation. These two countries are right next to each other. It was a former part of the Soviet Empire, and it was part of the Tsarist Empire. But the parallels are really kind of remarkable in the sense that, Great Britain was an empire, an autocratic empire. Russia is a totalitarian empire and has been since before the Bolshevik Revolution. And Ukraine is only holding out by the will of its people and by the resources and money being given from within the Ukraine, those people who had money, and of course outside from NATO countries and the United States being the largest contributor. Well, the American Revolution would not have likely succeeded without the money from the merchants who had amassed very large fortunes, like Nathaniel Tracey, and also with the help of France, which sided with the Americans. They were the longtime enemy of Great Britain, but without their international support, it also might not have been. So there are parallels in this situation we read about in the newspaper every day to what the Americans went through here. Now, I know that you already know a lot about Nathaniel Tracey, because you've all been to the library, right? It's the Tracey Mansion. You know he lived there. You know he was a very wealthy man. You know he was an ardent patriot. You know he ran a fleet of merchant vessels. You may know that he lost all his money after the Revolutionary War. So I saw my job as trying to fill in some of the details about his life, which might be of interest to kind of see that trajectory. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. And there's a couple of anecdotes in here which I found, which I certainly I'd never seen before and are kind of interesting. So the trajectory of his life really starts with his father, Patrick Tracey. And Patrick Tracey was an immigrant from Wexford, Ireland. It was said in at least one account that he was an orphan who was cheated out of his inheritance by his guardian, and that's the reason he left Ireland, which was, of course, ruled by Great Britain and ruled harshly at the time. He arrived in Boston on a boat because that's where he could get employment, and at about the age of 19. And he worked on boats for the next 20 years, learning about how merchant boats operated, learning about navigation. He was a smart guy. He learned quickly, and he became a shipmaster in time, working for others, sailing ships, particularly to Newfoundland. There was a lot of trade between Newburyport in this area and Newfoundland, bringing timber and lumber up to Newfoundland for building and bringing back hordes of fish. And that's where he began. We have a record of him in 1737 when he and 14 others joined the second meeting, it had just been established, of the Charitable Irish Society of Boston. And the Charitable Irish Society, remarkably, is still in existence. You can look it up and Google it. It's in Boston. It is the oldest Irish society in America. And what it does is provide assistance to people of Irish heritage who are in distress. And it continues to do that. It has an endowment. And its motto is, with goodwill doing service. It started out as a Lutheran organization. So the Irishmen who formed it were actually Lutheran Protestants, which is kind of remarkable. But it very soon, actually, within 30 to 40 years, began to allow Roman Catholics to join and to be assisted. It did not before that. Roman Catholics, you may not know this, but Roman Catholics were not allowed to settle in the Massachusetts Bay Colony until the 1720s. They were outlawed. They were thrown out. They had to go to Maryland, or they might get into Rhode Island, because Rhode Island was a much more liberal state, but they were not allowed. And when the Charitable Irish Society of Boston was formed, no person of Roman Catholic religion could hold elected office. And that didn't change until about 1840. So the society was a somewhat liberal organization in that it really incorporated and pulled people in. And you can read, if you go to their website and you read their history, Patrick Henry is figured prominently, actually, in their history. He was a very active member, and he helped a lot of people. Now, in time, he was able to purchase a ship. He saved his money. He was a smart guy. He got one ship, and then those other ships became even more ships. And he was, he was frequently at sea and made voyages to England, Ireland, the West Indies, and elsewhere. During the years 1753 and 1763, he owned at least 9 vessels, and a sloop and schooners. I like the name of the schooners. I'll just tell you what they are. He had a schooner named John, named Margaret, named Hannah, named Newbury, named Rainbow. Probably didn't have the same meaning then that it has now, does it? Charming Betty, Charming Sally, and Amherst. And during these years, to give you an idea of the kind of merchant that went on for merchants in those days, he was specialized in shipping lumber and bricks, which were made in the colonies, to Newfoundland, and then over time began to do shipments to Guadalupe, Antigua, West Indies Islands. He began shipping fish to Balboa, Cadiz, and Lisbon, and returned with molasses, absolutely essential for making rum, sugar, coffee, fish, oil, cranberries, interestingly enough, which were seen as a great delicacy in France and Spain. They never had seen them before. Sugar, salt, etc. And of course, he was also transporting slaves, because this was a slave era. And it's not emphasized much. He was not a major slave trader, as some merchants specialized in that. But slaves were human cargo. So if he was in the West Indies, he brought back slaves. And slaves, as you know, were sold on the docks in Boston, and they were sold on the docks in Newburyport. Newburyport primarily, and most of the New England area, except for exceptions where there were large farms, the slaves were used for household purposes, meaning they cleaned, they cooked, they took care of the horses, they took care of the stables. And again, just a little side note, one of again, we don't know our own history all that well always. One of the horrors about slavery is that when merchants went to the West Indies, the slaves they brought back were either very old people who could cook and do things like that and couldn't work in the fields anymore, or they took children. They took children around the ages of 8 or so, 9 or so, 7, 8, 9, because they couldn't be very productive in the sugar fields in bringing things in, but they could be sold as a valuable commodity, as household help, and they could grow up learning what to do in a household. At that time. And during this time, too, the British colonies, Britain was expanding its empire during this time, right? They were becoming the largest and most powerful naval force in the world, and the world had ever seen. And so the money that was being made in the colonies was seen by Britain as necessary for their work and their adventuring and their moving out. And as they saw people making more and more money, and people like Patrick Tracey started making a lot of money, as did many other merchants, they wanted a piece of the action and wanted a piece more and more. So the prelude to the rebellion was very much Great Britain clamping down on trade. It meant that you could only trade certain things to Great Britain. You were not allowed to trade them to France or Spain or any other place. Things like tobacco, cotton wool, which was used for uniforms and such, had to be traded with Great Britain and had to be traded at their price, no one else's. Other duties were materials had to be brought to Britain to see if they were needed and then could be taken to other countries. So gradually that tightened and tightened and tightened on merchants and took more money away from them, and they became more and more disenchanted. The other thing that I found out that really, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, is, and you've all heard this term, I'm sure, privateers, right? Privateers legalized piracy. You know, ships going out and taking over other ships from other countries and sacking all the supplies within it and taking the crew prisoner and trying to ransom them for money. Well, that didn't start with the American Revolutionary War. That had been going on for probably 80 or 90 years by merchants. And Patrick Tracey, I didn't see a record that he was deeply involved in doing that, but he may have done some of it. Others were more deeply involved. And Britain at this time, for 80 to 90 years before the American Revolution broke out, had been at war with France, Spain, separately and together. And during that time, merchant vessels could obtain a letter of marque which granted them the privilege of capturing ships from those countries and sacking the supplies which those brought and capturing the crews. And the amount of money they were brought back, the supplies were sold, and the crew of the ship was given a share of that, you know, with the captain getting most shares. The average seaman got about 1 share. They had 100 shares, and they were divided in between. The average seaman got 1 share of the cost of all that. But, of course, Great Britain got a good cut of that, right? So that kind of activity went on. When the war ended, they had to stop doing this, although not everybody did. Some people went on to become just plain old pirates. But they needed to stop doing that, or it was against the law, and they could be punished, and their ship could be impounded. So all of this was going on as a kind of prelude to all of this. Now, let me see if there's anything else. I think that's what I wanted to say about Patrick Henry, and I'll tell you a little more. Patrick Henry, by the way, is buried at St. Paul's graveyard. You can still read his inscription. I'll read it to you. Underneath are the remains of Patrick Tracey, Esquire, who departed this life February 28, 1789, aged 78 years. In various and strongly contrasted scenes of life, he eminently shone as a man, a citizen, and a Christian. His firm expectation of a future existence moderated his temper in prosperity, supported him in adversity, and enabled him to triumph in death. Beautifully written piece, isn't it? I mean, really. And, you know, I do have a picture of him. I'll leave it up here. You won't be able to see it too well here. But, you know, this is a picture which is actually in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And it was painted by John Trumbull. I mean, you know, John Trumbull, you know, Washington Crossing the Delaware and all that, and lots of other kinds of paintings. And it really gives a sense of him, you know, with his anchor and the sea behind him and all of that. It's a lovely portrait. So Patrick Henry was married 3 times. His first wife, Hannah Carter, died at the age of 28. She had 2 births, 2 children. One died at 9 months, one died at 2 months. And this is the picture of family life that we need to kind of keep in our heads. You know, in the 1700s, that infants died. The infant mortality rate was enormous. And the death rate of women giving birth was enormous. When I do tours of St. Paul's graveyard, and I always say, who do you think's, what group is buried here who are there more of? Would you say men or women? And half the time people say men, and I say absolutely not, women. Men had 2 or 3 wives. They died. They died in childbirth. They died of disease. They died from very inadequate medical help. So his first wife, likely that happened. His second wife was Hannah Gookin, and she was the daughter of a minister from New Hampshire. And she produced for him 3 sons. The oldest son, Nathaniel Tracey, that we're talking about today, in 1751. A son, John, 2 years later, 1753. And a daughter, Hannah, in 1755. And all of those children lived to adult life. Hannah, in fact, married Jonathan Jackson. The Jackson Museum on High Street, and he also took over the Tracey Mansion after Nathaniel left. And Jonathan Jackson was from a prominent Boston family. He was also her second cousin. And it wasn't an unusual thing to marry a second cousin, because if you didn't grow up together, even a first cousin, it wasn't unheard of. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of. Especially if you grew up in different areas and with different family groups and all that, transportation was difficult. Because it was a way of consolidating wealth and name within the elites and the hierarchy. This was a very class-oriented society, just like Great Britain was. Now, Nathaniel Tracey. Nathaniel Tracey was born in Newbury in August 11th, 1751. Later became Newburyport. And he, as I said, was the eldest son. And he was educated at Harvard University, because that's where men of wealth and privilege went. You usually went, it was kind of like high school. It was Harvard College in those days. You went when you were 14, and you usually graduated when you were 17 or 18. And that's what he did. He graduated at 18, and he spent additional time at Harvard achieving a master's degree in 1772. So he spent quite a bit of time there, and he had cousins there, and he knew the families, and he became familiar and friendly with that level of elite. Now, after he graduated, he and his brother John and his brother-in-law, Jonathan Jackson, formed a new firm called Jackson, Tracey and Tracey. And they developed, they were young men at Harvard, and you can imagine, the energy, if you have children, it looks like most of you do, have children who are in their 20s at some point, the energy that's there and the idealism and all of that. So they were very taken up by the cause of independence and the rebellion against the oppression that they were feeling and from Great Britain, and also the tradition of monarchy from Great Britain. So these new ideas were flooding through there, and it was certainly with that group. Now, in 1775, so they began actually building up their empire of boats. They had a lot of resources. They bought boats, and these boats really were engaged in merchant activity throughout the world, according to the rules set down by Great Britain. And they did remarkably well. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. Now, in 1775, at the age of 23, Nathaniel Tracey married Mary Lee, the daughter of Colonel Jeremiah and Martha Lee of Marblehead, considered to be a great beauty. Her father was very active also in the Revolution and was elected to the First Continental Congress. Now, the For a wedding gift, Patrick Henry had decided for quite a while that he was going to build a grand mansion befitting of his wealth and his family's wealth on what was called Fish Street. It's now called State Street. And one piece I didn't know was there was a house there originally. There was a wooden structure, and it was owned by Reverend, one of the Lowells, I think, Reverend Lowell, and it was moved from that site to Temple Street. Do you know where on Temple? You're nodding your head. Linda, you would know. Where is it on Temple?
If you're going from State down Temple, it's probably the fourth house on the right. And it has a sign on it that says it's a Lowell house.
Oh, okay. Which he was going to was really the prime mover along with Jonathan Jackson in this business. Grand a mansion as he possibly could. It was said to be one of the most elegant in the Commonwealth. The family owned slaves, as did all the wealthy merchants. They managed the house. Carriages, it was said, had liveried drivers, 6 in hand, with outsiders, such as never had been seen in this town before. Births Mary had. Of those, very few lived to adult life. We know of 11 that are recorded. Her first child, Hannah Tracey, lived and married and had 2 children. The second child, Martha, died 1 year, 4 months. Son Patrick, 17, died. I don't know whether he died of disease or at sea. Nathaniel died at 6 to 7 years. Jeremiah, 62 years. He lived to adulthood, but did not marry. Mary died at 23, unmarried. Louisa died 82, unmarried. And she became the person who was got the estate from the Tracey family, that which was left. And she bequeathed a lot of those items to in Newburyport. You can see them around at the old Newbury Museum and some at the public library and such. She never married. He had another son he named Nathaniel, who died at 1.5 years, and another son, Nathaniel, who did live until the age of 76, married twice, and had 3 children, so he had descendants. A daughter, Martha, who died at 28 years old, unmarried, and a daughter, Helen, 69 years old, who died unmarried. Now, because the rebellion really began, before we know the revolution is dated 1776, but it really began before that because of these pockets of rebellion and pockets of protest that developed all over the place. And the Continental Congress, began in 1774 as an administrative arm which began to manage the idea of independence. They tried through negotiation, but then when that fell down and they saw that was going nowhere, then the Declaration became a part of life. Now, when hostilities really did break out in 1775, before the actual announcement of the revolution, Nathaniel had constructed the first Yankee privateer. It was called the Yankee Hero. And it was so successful at capturing merchant ships that he had quite a few others built. It said that in the first 2 months he went out, he captured a very wealthy British merchant ship. And within 8 to 9 months out, he had captured by close to a dozen. So they were enormously successful. Now these were boats which were specifically made for battle. I mean, they had guns, and so most merchant ships had guns, but they were not outfitted for warfare. But the Yankee Hero and the other boats which he built were. And they were all under a commission of war from the Continental Congress. And under a letter of marque or license to attack foreign vessels and to take them as prizes, along with their goods, and take prize crews for exchange. And the exchange was a profitable piece of business. Now, it's said, and this to give you an idea of the nature and extent, Nathaniel sent out approximately 24 privateering cruisers, and they captured 120 vessels and 2,225 prisoners between 1775, when they began, and the end of the war in 1783. The ships and cargo sold for about $4 million, which is a pretty amazing sum then. If you added inflation to our figures, no investment income, just inflation, that would be $135 million, 543, 168 and 97 cents. He also had at sea a fleet of 110 merchant vessels. And they were enormously successful too, because they were protected by his fleet of privateering cruisers, which were very well armed. And during this time period of the war, Nathaniel Tracey was considered the wealthiest man in America, which is a pretty amazing thing to say, with a personal worth of over $4 million. Now, during this period, he bought real estate on the east coast of the colonies. It was said that he owned country seats, summer retreats, hunting grounds, fine fish pounds, as would have become a British lord. Due to his affluence, it was claimed he could travel from Newburyport to Philadelphia and sleep under his own roof every night. One of the houses he owned, and I've got a great story to tell you about that in a little bit, was the Vassal House in Cambridge. And you may know that now as the Longfellow House. But it was originally owned by a loyalist named Vassal. And when the loyalists were going to be either put in jail or forcibly kicked out, he left. And of course, the local government took over ownership of the house and then sold it in order to fund the war effort. Well, Nathaniel Tracey bought it. Now, as the war progressed, the war did not go well in the beginning. It did not at all go well. They had a lot of enthusiastic people, but they weren't very well trained. They were a very ragged army. Britain was very skillful and organized, although it had its troops spread all around the world. And at first it didn't take it quite seriously. It thought, this will be an easy to put down, right, Putin? We'll just get Kiev, no problem. Well, it turned out the steel and the might of the Americans was very much underestimated by King George and the Parliament of Britain. In September of 1775, again before the full announcement, Nathaniel Tracey received instructions from George Washington, someone who he knew and someone he had met. This was actually after, of course, the Boston Tea Party took place, which was in 1773 against the Stamp Act. Again, another oppressive British, we're taking your money because we need it elsewhere, kind of an act. And you probably know, just as a side note about the Newburyport Tea Party, it was often said that happened before the British Tea Party. Well, it didn't. It happened in 1774 and 1775. one of a boat owner got riled up one day, and he took his crew, and the British authorities here had locked up all the tea because of all this controversy in a blockade house, and he went up with his guys with axes, and they axed down the door, and they dragged it to Market Square, and they set it all on fire, and cursed the British while they were doing it. And then after that, they did it one more time. This guy was named Eleazar Johnson, a shipbuilder, and he led his carpenters in the destruction of the tea. They also did it at the bottom of what is now Federal Street, which seemed like an appropriate place because the first Presbyterian church on Federal Street, the pastor at that time was an adamant revolutionary. He was preaching against the king. He thought he was a heretic. I mean, he was vehement. It was lucky he escaped being tied up. But anyway, let's just look at what happened in 1775 and the letter that Nathaniel Tracey received from George Washington. You are hereby authorized and empowered to take up for the service of the colonies so many vessels as shall be necessary for the transporting of a body of troops to be detached from this army on a secret expedition. Freight of such vessels to be paid in such a manner and at such a rate as endorsed herein. And in the case of loss or damage to such vessels or any other such loss or damage to be compensated by the public according to an estimation made before said vessels proceed in said service. So that was a dramatic moment for Nathaniel Tracey. And what in the world did that mean? Well, here's where Benedict Arnold comes into the picture, right? We all know him as the traitor, right? He's the guy who became the traitor and sold out, the plans for the West Point fort to the British. Well, prior to that, he was a pretty adamant revolutionary and actually was a highly skilled man. One historian I found really interesting said, Benedict Arnold was a brilliant strategist, but a terrible tactician. He wasn't good with the details, but he was great with the ideas. On the other hand, if you look at some of what was happening with George Washington was a very smart tactician and also a smart strategist. But he paid attention to the details and saw the overview. He was a remarkable man, and the more you read about his life, the more remarkable I begin to think of him. Now, Arnold had been in Canada, and first proposed to George Washington in 1775 an invasion of Canada, and it was a brilliant strategy because Arnold argued with Washington that Quebec had huge potential benefits. In addition to depriving the British of a staging area for attacking the 13 colonies from the north, Americans envisioned, and Arnold envisioned, that French Canadians might seize the opportunity to rise up against the British and fight for their own independence. After all, they were French, and the French were on the side of the Americans against Great Britain. Now, he also wrote to the Continental Congress, this is Arnold, saying that taking Quebec would deprive the British of the lucrative fur trade and secure an inexhaustible granary of Canadian wheat to feed Americans. Now, Washington didn't need a lot of convincing about the strategy. He thought it was all very sound. And also the British only had 775 troops in Canada and 300 troops guarding Quebec. Now, the change that Washington made was, I don't think one army of Americans should proceed all the way up to Quebec because that's going to be an alarm. We need to divide it into two. So Montgomery, you're going up through New York State, and Arnold, you're going up through Maine. Arnold reluctantly agreed. Now, the problem was, as one historian said, everything went wrong. It was a problem getting pay for the men who were going on the thing. They had to give them some money so they could support their families. They were going to be gone for months. It took a while for that money to arrive. They were here in Newburyport. If you've done the tour of the First Presbyterian Church, you know, they talk about still seeing the spur marks on the backs, on the bottom of the pews from where the officers, you know, were wearing their uniforms and spurs, and it dug into the wood. You know, they were late getting up there. The maps they had were inaccurate. The route turned out to be far longer and more arduous than they envisioned. It meant going through swamp territory. But Tracey's task was to deliver them to the beginning of the Kennebec River. And they would disembark with all their supplies, and then they would get in barges and go up the river until they had to go across land. Well, one of the great problems that happened was that the guy they hired to make the barges, he had some barges, but they needed a lot more barges for all these supplies that were going with them. He turned out to be a secret loyalist, and no one knew. So he made the barges out of very green wood, and he put no caulking in them. So they floated in the river for a while, and then they began to sink. And so an enormous amount of supplies were lost through that effort. They ran into a brutal hurricane, and many of Arnold's men said, "I've had it, I'm going back." He started out with over 1,000 troops, and by the time he got to his destination, it was November, and he had 675 starving, poorly armed soldiers left, according to historians' account. In the meantime, the British, no fools, right? No fools, saw this was all happening. And, you know, the British commander in Canada rushed troops there, and they got British reinforcements. They were battle-hardened Scottish veterans of the French and Indian Wars, so they were ready to take on anybody. And they arrived to bolster to the defenses. Now, as one kind of this famous historian, I don't have his where he works, Professor Emeritus at Champlain College and author of the book on, kind of the seminal book on Patrick Tracey, said, if Arnold had gotten to Quebec 3 days earlier, it might have worked, and he could have succeeded because they were under-fortified. He almost pulled it off. But it turned out that by the time he got there and they launched their assault on Quebec City with Montgomery, he had to wait for Montgomery to get there. It was New Year's Eve, it was a blinding blizzard, and it quickly turned into a disaster. A single volley of cannon fire killed Montgomery and most of his officers. Arnold was severely wounded in the leg by a rifle shot and had to be dragged off the field. Most of the American force was killed, wounded, captured, so that 300 of the men who survived the journey with Arnold to Quebec, only 100 were left. And the defeat sent an amazing panic among the colonies and among the Americans, as Arnold himself conceded. But to his credit, Arnold didn't give up. He didn't immediately go back. With his 100 men, he continued to try to fire upon the city of Quebec and all of the forces. He was actually, one account gives a pretty smart tactic of having these cannons and then dragging them far away and shooting again, and then dragging them some other place, shooting apart. So they thought they had a lot more cannons than they really did. But, you know, it was over. Washington's authorized reinforcements. When the reinforcements arrived, they called Arnold back. And 3 months later said, you know, this is crazy for us to be here. And they retreated fully with the arrival of a British fleet from the empire of 10,000 regulars and German mercenaries. So they knew it was over. And Arnold was crushed, you know. He really thought that this was going to succeed. He was particularly crushed that the French Canadians didn't rise up against the British. This was their opportunity. But the British, you know, the British were no fools, right? I mean, they didn't get control of half the world by not thinking things through a little bit. They underestimated the colonies, but they had conferred in 1774, when they thought this might be a possibility, the Quebec Act. And that meant that French Canadians, even if they were Catholics, were given legal status by the British, could own land, and could hold minor offices. So they felt the French Canadians, if anything, saw the American invaders as a Protestant invasion, which might take away their rights. It's interesting, isn't it? So, you know, unfortunately, Arnold, you know, didn't do well, and he became discouraged. His reputation was besmirched by all this, and although he continued to fight, he wasn't seen as the person who was a driving force in the defense of many places. And he became very discouraged and despondent about that they had lost confidence in him. And that's some of what led him to that and the money. Britain gave him money and a commission to sell out the Americans and leave. But it shows you how different the story, you know, I mean, again, I keep thinking of Ukraine, how it keeps changing from one day to another, and the story is kind of remarkable. Well, the war, you know, didn't go very well. I mean, you know, Valley Forge wasn't exactly a triumph, was it? I mean, and all. And there was a lot of feeling that the war might not succeed. But that all changed in 1775 with the Battle of Saratoga. It was a turning point for the American Revolution. They defeated a superior British army, which lifted patriot morale tremendously. And it helped to secure additional foreign support needed to win the war. So they started getting money because the other countries, particularly France, but even other countries, saw, okay, this is going to be something that is going to help defeat the British and forward our interests. It shattered the idea of the empire's invincibility as a world power, and like I said, a great morale boost. And France entered the war in 1778, and it became an international war. Now, there is a wonderful story. You know, there's lots of, Nathaniel Tracey continued doing what he was doing. He continued making vast amounts of money. He continued using that money to support various activities of the revolution. He was in correspondence on a regular basis with Washington and people in the Continental Army. But there's a great story, which I had never heard before, about, you know, the French, as I said, which entered the war. Before the Battle of Yorktown, which was really the closing chapter of the war in 1781. The French sent troops, 6,300 troops, to Boston. And Nathaniel Tracey, and they were going to march south to the siege of Yorktown and join Washington's troop and fight with them in this major battle. They were still wildly outnumbered, but you know, they were supporting the Americans because there was some belief that the British might not be as invincible as we thought they were. Well, when they arrived in Boston in May 1781, Nathaniel Tracey, who owned this house, the Vassal House, now the Longfellow House, invited them over to his beautiful villa in Cambridge, the admiral and all of his officers for a grand feast. Now, this is a recount of the feast, which was written by one of the sons of someone who was present. The Mr. Nathaniel Tracey, who lived in a beautiful villa in Cambridge, made a great feast for the admiral and his officers. Everything was furnished that could be had in the country to ornament and give variety to the entertainment. My father was one of the guests and told me that after 2 large tureens of soup were placed at the ends of the table, the admiral sat on the right of Mr. Tracey, and Monsieur de la, I don't speak French, de Latombe on his left. Monsieur Latombe was the consul of France and resident in Boston. Tracey filled a plate with soup, which went first to the admiral as the most honored guest. The next was handed to the consul. As soon as Lacombe put his spoon into the plate, he fished up a large frog. Just as green as perfect as it had been hopped from the pond into the tureen. Not knowing what it was at first, he seized it by one of its hind legs, and holding it up in view of the whole company, discovered that it was a full-grown cooked frog. As soon as he thoroughly inspected it and made himself sure of the matter, he exclaimed, "Ah, mon Dieu, how do you say frog? Grenouille." Then, turning to the gentleman next to him, gave him the frog. He received it and passed it around the table. Thus, the poor frog made the tour from hand to hand until it reached the admiral. The company convulsed with laughter, examining the soup plates as the servants brought them in, and in each one was to be found a frog in broth. The uproar was universal. Meanwhile, Tracey kept his ladle going, wondering what his outlandish guests meant by such extravagant merriment. "What's the matter?" he said, raising his head, surveying the frogs dangling by legs in all directions. "Why don't they eat them?" he exclaimed. "If they knew the confounded trouble I had to catch them in order to treat them to a dish of their own country, they would find that with me at least it was no joking matter." He got a little irritated. Thus was poor Tracey, deceived by vulgar prejudice and common report. He had caused all the swamps of Cambridge to be searched in order to furnish them with a generous supply of what he believed to be in France a standing national dish. Isn't that a great story? Well, you know, the French troops went on to the Battle of what did I say? Yorktown. And in October 1781, it came to an end. As I said, vastly outnumbered. They defeated Cornwallis, and essentially the war came to an end. No more major battles occurred. In April 1782, a new British government was formed, which accepted American independence. And then after endless and extensive negotiations, the Treaty of Paris was formed. Now, what enormous success, huh? What incredible success all of this was. So, what happened? Well, I don't know. Life doesn't go the way you think it's going to go, does it? And it certainly didn't go that way for Tracey. What happened was, as one book says, the vicissitudes of fortunes turned against him. The Continental Congress had unleashed a fleet of legalized piracy against British commerce. And when the war ended, Britain moved to defend itself. The war was over. There was no more privateering. And most of Tracey's privateer vessels were lost in the conflict. Britain now really turned up the heat because they didn't want their trading interfered with by a country that they no longer controlled. The crews of with the British Navy, meaning they had to fight on British ships. The remaining vessels were detained or abandoned in whatever port they were used for supplies. Tracey's merchant fleet fared no better. The American ships were no longer protected as colonial properties under the treaties with European countries, meaning they were a part of the British Empire. So Britain had these treaties with all these countries. You will not interfere with our merchant vessels, and we'll make this concession, and you make that concession, and these treaties all stood. Well, after the end of the war, America was no longer a part of the British Empire, number one, and number two, it had no navy. It just had these privateers that were individually controlled and flying around. Britain had an organized navy with a hierarchy and very competent commanders. So, they were no longer protected, and foreign governments saw that the new United States, although it could defend itself on its own soil with the help of France, could not protect itself with war. American crews and cargoes were seized or delayed until their cargoes spoiled. Everywhere international trade took place. There was one particularly wealthy shipment that went to Spain, and they just kept it. And he tried to get it back and couldn't. American ships also became, and this is a whole other history piece that it'd be interesting to read about. American ships became then a particular target of the Barbary pirates, right? Barbary pirates from Turkey and from some of the countries around Turkey just saw it as fair game. Nobody was going to protect them. Nobody was going to come to their aid. And ironically, American merchant crews were, in large part from Tracey's ship, sold into slavery in the Ottoman Empire. And they remained there unless you could pay enough money to get them out. So if they had relatives who had money, they might be able to get out. If they did not, they served the rest of their life throughout the Ottoman Empire as slaves. Enormous ironies in all of this. In fact, the American merchant ship crews joined, it is said, over 1 million Europeans in Ottoman slavery. It's really an incredible story, isn't it? So all of this was happening to Nathaniel Tracey, and it happened fairly quickly. And suddenly, he owed tremendous amounts of money to people who he had been funding and who he planned to make profits and pay and all of that. So he was trying to make sense of his affairs. And so he was on his way. He decided to go to Britain and try to work with some of the creditors and some of the people who had his boats throughout the British Empire. And, he got a plan to go on a ship in July of 1784. Now, at the same time he was planning to take that trip, Thomas Jefferson arrived in Boston because the Continental Congress, or the Confederation Congress, had appointed Jefferson as a minister plenipotentiary to the court of Versailles and directed him to join Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in Paris, where he would become the senior minister in France. And, Jefferson got here, and he wanted to go with Abigail Adams, who was leaving, who was 36 hours from sailing when he arrived. But he couldn't get all his affairs in office, so he was going to go to New York City to take a ship which was going to sail on the 15th of July. But Nathaniel Tracey's ship, the Ceres, was going to be leaving before then, and Tracey convinced him, they knew each other a bit, to join him and sail over with him. And Jefferson agreed. Jefferson, in the meantime, spent 3 days in Boston, and then he traveled to Salem, Ipswich, Marblehead, Newbury, Portsmouth, Exeter, and back in Boston, where he sold his horse, and he purchased 4 dozen bottles of hock. I had to look that up. What the heck is hock? German white wine, I found out. Apples, oranges, bedding, 2 chamber pots, a table and a chair. And he joined Tracey on this trip over. He went with his daughter Martha, who was about 8 or 9 years old. I don't remember exactly. And his other 2 older daughters stayed behind in Virginia. Jefferson's wife had died. He was a widow. And Patsy actually kept a diary of their travels, which is a pretty interesting. And I'll read you just a little bit of what she said. She was a young girl. The other thing that is noteworthy about Jefferson's trip with Tracey is that he brought with him 2 slaves. He brought a female slave to tend to he and his child. And he also brought James Hemings. Guess who James Hemings was the brother of? Yeah, Sally Hemings, who came a couple of years later with the older girls. And, who's pretty substantially thought to have had 4 children with Jefferson. But Jefferson, again, was a widower and devoting himself to all of this stuff. Well, I'll read you a little bit, of what Patsy has to say about her trip. She kept an extensive diary. It's in this lovely little old book, well out of print. June 18. Papa and Governor Hancock talk of treaties of commerce Papa hopes to make with other countries. It is very boring. Papa has been on board Mr. Tracey's ship, Ceres. It will sail in about 10 days. We'd hoped to accompany Mr. Adams' wife and daughter, who are joining Mr. Adams, but they already departed. While waiting for the Ceres to sail, Papa has taken a short trip to the north as far as New Hampshire. I congratulate myself on having visited 9 of the 13 states. Can't you just picture a proud little girl saying that? The Ceres is sailing to London, but will land us on the Isle of Wight. There we shall cross into Spitalhead to Portsmouth on the English mainland, and then we shall cross the English Channel to Le Havre in France. I pray that I will not get seasick. We have sent cod's tongues, smoked salmon, halibut, and archives to Uncle Epps. A letter assures us that my sisters are well. Little Lucy prattles everything she hears. My heart aches when I think of leaving my sisters behind. July 8th, at 4 in the morning of July 5th, we left port. Sunshine has remained with us all the way. The sea is as calm as a river, but little Runa flutters her wings and will not sing. She brought her little bird with her little pet. As usual, Papa is interested in keeping records. He daily records our latitude and longitude and how many miles we logged. I told Papa I will hide his record book if he does not buy me some of the famous ice cream in Paris. For 3 days, July 11th, for 3 days we have becalmed all the great banks of Newfoundland. The crew and passengers entertain themselves by fishing. Even I have caught a cod. So Tracey went to London and tried to sort these out. Let's see what time it is. Oh, goodness, I'm actually over. But he didn't have any success. His debtors, would not budge. He had no negotiations. He had a large debt to a Spanish guy who cheated him out of repaying him for money owes. And so he was heading very clearly towards bankruptcy. He returned and said, broken-hearted and discouraged. Of his merchant fleet, only 1 cruiser was suitable for long-term travel. He was further compromised, as I said, by a contract negotiated by one of the agents furnishing his French Navy. This was with scrap metal ship masts with solid wood, which was stolen from him, and also a principal Spanish creditor, Gardoqui, who defaulted on his debt. And in 1786, he owed more money than he could possibly pay and was bankrupt. He liquidated his remaining properties, including the mansion on State Street, which he sold to his brother and former partner, Jonathan Jackson, to retire to the Spencer Pierce Little Farm in Newbury. The farm was leased to his father, who was still alive, who allowed him to live there. And then, 2 years later, after his father's death, he purchased the property. And he purchased it on April 6th, 1791, where it is said he lived out the rest of his life with dignity and firmness. His debtors in the Americas acknowledged his generosity and role in establishing the new nation and did not press him for collection. George Washington, of course, came to Newburyport in 1789 and stayed at the Tracey mansion, or at least had dinner there, I think, and also visited with Tracey. John Adams, was here in 1788, 1789 doing a law study with Theophilus Parsons, who was a very famous lawyer at the time. And he writes in his diary, Pickman had agreed to go with me and hear Parson Tucker preach this afternoon, but some circumstance prevented him, so I went alone. He gave a very good sermon on the education of children. I went home with Mr. Tracey to dinner, and Pickman soon came in. We dined and passed the afternoon with Mr. Tracey. This gentleman was in the course of the war particularly fortunate and accumulated an immense fortune, but he has since been equally unlucky and is now very much reduced. The generosity of his heart is equal to any estate whatever. And although he has not been so prudent as he might have wished, yet everyone who is acquainted with him must lament his misfortune and heartily wish he may retrieve his affairs. So it's an interesting piece, and of course, then Tracey died. He died young. He died in 2 years after his, 7 years after his father died. He died in 1796 at the age of 45. And he's buried at the Old Hill burial ground. I tried to get the inscription on it, but it's so eroded, it's impossible to read. It doesn't say much because he didn't have much money. Probably someone else paid for that and just has his name and his birthday on it. So, that is the story of Nathaniel Tracey. I can ask quickly if you have any questions or any comments. Or, go ahead.
When you had all those ships, were they here in Newburyport or were they all over the place?